They tried to shame a young black girl for the way she wore her hair. Instead, her braids became the spark that united a movement no one saw coming. The afternoon sun stretched lazily across the suburban skyline, painting the schoolyard in hues of gold and amber. It was the kind of light that made everything look softer, gentler. The rusted fence seemed less harsh, the cracked pavement less unforgiving. The glass panes of the administrative office caught the sunlight and threw it back in sharp, gleaming reflections, as though the building itself wanted to blind anyone daring to stare along. Behind that glass, shadows moved, stiff and blurred, but the life of the school pulsed outside, in the laughter echoing down hallways and the shouts of children chasing each other across the yard. And in the middle of it all, she walked out. Her name did not matter yet. What mattered was the presence she carried, though she was only 13. A young black girl, slender but tall for her age, with skin the color of rich earth and eyes that caught light the way polished stone did. Her hair was braided into long, meticulous rows, every braid ending in a delicate bead. The beads clinked softly with each movement, a rhythm only she owned, like a private melody that accompanied her steps. She walked with the quiet poise of someone who had been told all her life to hold her head high, even when others tried to push it down. Her uniform was slightly oversized, the white blouse hanging loose on her shoulders, the navy blue skirt brushing against her knees. She carried her books close to her chest, not in fear, but in a kind of reverence, as if knowledge was something sacred. The sunlight touched her braids, making them shine as if every strand had been dipped in gold. The beads sparkled faintly when the rays hit just right. Some of them were plain, simple, clear beads. Others were bright, vibrant colors: red, green, yellow, echoing the tones of stories and traditions much older than the school's neatly trimmed lawn. Each bead had been threaded with care by her mother's hands the night before, a labor of patience, love, and cultural pride. She did not think about these things as she walked. To her, it was just her hair, just her way of being herself. But to anyone who took the time to notice, it was a statement, a tapestry of history woven into the present. Her steps were confident, though not arrogant. She moved as though she belonged everywhere she set her foot, even in a place where belonging was never guaranteed. Some students glanced at her when she passed, the way her braids swung, the way her eyes seemed to glow with a quiet certainty. Some smiled, some whispered, and some pretended not to look at all. But she did not shrink. The clinking of her beads followed her into the building, echoing against the tiled floor. Tick, 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 like raindrops on a window, like the soft chiming of wind against glass. Teachers paused their conversations for half a second, eyes flicking toward her before quickly returning to their papers or coffee cups. They didn't realize they stared. They didn't realize the weight of those fleeting glances. She walked past the bulletin board filled with brightly colored posters: Student of the Month, chess club tryouts, spring dance coming soon. Her eyes skimmed them, but didn't linger. She was not thinking about clubs or dances or competitions. She was thinking about how the day felt light, how maybe this week would be a good one, how maybe she could carry that hopeful glow all the way through Friday. There was brightness in her eyes, a spark that came from somewhere deep within. It was the look of a child who still believed in the goodness of the world, even if shadows sometimes pressed close. It was the look of someone who saw herself not only as she was now, but as she could be in the future, a future wide open, filled with promise. Her braids swayed as she turned the corner, beads clicking together like quiet applause. A pair of younger students stopped in the hallway just to watch her, not because she was different in a way that frightened them, but because she carried something magnetic, something that drew the gaze and made it linger. The air around her seemed to hold its breath for a moment, and yet, beneath the golden warmth of the afternoon sun, beneath the clinking melody of her beads, beneath the soft confidence of her stride, there was something else, something small, unspoken, a tension hidden in the way her shoulders stiffened just slightly. When she reached the office corridor, a shadow that crossed her face for only an instant, like a cloud over the sun. She shook it away quickly, pushing the thought aside, focusing instead on the rhythm of her steps, the feel of the polished floor beneath her shoes, the gentle weight of her books pressing into her chest. But the feeling lingered. The glass doors of the administrative office gleamed at the end of the hall, reflecting her small frame back at her, distorting her shape in a way that felt strange, unfamiliar. For a heartbeat, she saw herself not as she was a confident girl with braids and bright eyes, but as something blurred, reduced, incomplete. She blinked and the reflection settled. The sunlight flashed again against the glass, sharp and blinding. She lifted her chin higher, as though daring the building to challenge her, as though her very presence could carve space where none had been freely offered. And so, she kept walking her, beads clinking, her eyes bright, her spirit unshaken. At least, not yet. The hallway was alive with the usual noise of the afternoon rush shoes squeaking against the tiles, lockers slamming shut, voices bouncing against the walls in bursts of laughter and gossip. She moved through it all with quiet ease, her beads clinking like tiny bells against the chaos. It was in that ordinary moment, when everything felt steady and almost beautiful, that the disruption came. A teacher stepped into her path. It was Mrs. Whitmore, the language arts teacher, a woman known more for her love of Shakespeare than for her warmth. Her thin-framed glasses sat low on her nose, and she clutched a clipboard so tightly her knuckles were pale. There was something strange in the way she stopped the girl, not with the firm authority of a teacher correcting a student, but with an uneasy hesitation, like she wasn't sure whether she wanted to be seen doing it. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Her voice was lowered, almost secretive, the kind of tone people used when they wanted the world not to hear. The girl blinked, hugging her books a little tighter against her chest. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Whitmore shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her eyes flickered to the students passing by, then back to the girl. As if afraid of being overheard, she cleared her throat. "It's about the dress code." The words dropped between them like pebbles in a pond, rippling outward. The girl frowned. Her uniform was the same as everyone else's: white blouse, navy skirt, socks pulled up just below her knees. "I don't understand," she said softly. "It's your hair." Mrs. Whitmore muttered, glancing away for a moment. "The braids. They don't comply with the school's guidelines." Her beads clicked softly as she shifted. "My hair. Yes," the teacher said quickly, as though she wanted to get the words out before doubt stopped her. "It's distracting for the other students." Distracting. The word landed heavy in the girl's ears. Foreign and cruel. She looked at Mrs. Whitmore with wide eyes, confusion spilling across her face. Her braids were neat, every strand tucked into place by her mother's careful hands. They weren't messy. They weren't wild. They were clean, beautiful. Hers, round, them. The hallway noise dulled, as if the other students could feel something unusual taking place. A few lingered nearby, slowing their steps. Eyes darted from the teacher to the girl, then back again. Whispered exchanges rippled through the group. "She's in trouble," one boy murmured under his breath. "For her hair?" Another whispered back, brows furrowed. The girl's cheeks warmed, but not from shame, from bewilderment. Her mind raced, searching for logic, for some kind of rule she had broken without realizing. How could her hair, something she'd been taught to take pride in, become a violation? She forced herself to stand tall, even as uncertainty pressed down on her. "I didn't know the rules said anything about hair like mine." Mrs. Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. Her face tightened, the way people's faces did when they carried out orders they didn't believe in but wouldn't resist. It's in the handbook. Hairstyles must be professional and non-distracting. That's all I can say. Professional, non-distracting. Words that sounded harmless on paper, but stung like needles when spoken here, in this hallway, with so many ears listening. The girl's beads chimed as she exhaled sharply. "But it's just braids," she said, her voice steadier now. "It's just my hair." Mrs. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't answer. She just gestured toward the office, a silent demand that ended the conversation without resolving it. The girl hesitated. Every muscle in her body screamed to resist, to demand clarity, to say this was wrong. But her feet carried her forward anyway, the sound of her beads louder than ever in the silence that followed. Tick, 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 like a metronome counting the beats of her growing unease behind her. The students exchanged looks, confused, unsettled. Some frowned, some shook their heads. No one spoke up, not yet. The injustice hung in the air, sharp and invisible, like the faint smell of smoke before anyone sees the fire. One girl leaned toward her friend and whispered, "But her hair's beautiful." "I know," the other replied, glancing nervously toward the office door where the beads had disappeared. Inside the girl's chest, something heavy settled. She didn't have the words for it yet, this mixture of hurt, confusion, and an anger that was just beginning to spark. She only knew it felt wrong, deeply wrong. The teacher had called it a dress code violation. But in her heart, the girl felt the truth pressing in. This wasn't about rules. It was about something else, something deeper, something that made her existence in that hallway suddenly feel fragile. As the glass doors of the office loomed closer, she tried to steady her breathing, tried to cling to that brightness that had carried her through the day. But it flickered now, unsteady, as if a wind she could not see was threatening to blow it out. She glanced once over her shoulder. Her classmates were still watching, their faces puzzled, uncertain. Their silence felt heavier than words, and in that silence, in those puzzled glances, the first cracks appeared, the small but undeniable signs that the day would not end the way it had begun. The office smelled faintly of floor polish and paper, the kind of sterile scent meant to remind students of order and rules. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, too bright, too unforgiving, washing every corner in harsh white. The girl sat in a stiff wooden chair outside the principal's office, her books stacked neatly in her lap, her braids resting against her shoulders. She ran her fingers over the smooth beads, one by one, as though their rhythm could keep her grounded. Through the closed door, muffled voice is leaked out low, measured tones that carried the weight of authority. Her name floated in and out of the air like smoke. She pressed her ear closer to the door, her heart thudding harder each time it was spoken. Finally, the secretary looked up from behind the desk and said with forced cheer, "Your parents are on their way." The principal thought it best to discuss this with them directly. The girl nodded, though the words did nothing to soothe her. Instead, they twisted inside her chest. Why did something as simple as her hair require her parents to be summoned? Minutes stretched into what felt like hours until the door opened and Principal Harris emerged. He was a tall man with thinning gray hair, his tie slightly loosened, as if he were always tired of his own authority. His expression was not cruel, but it carried the detached firmness of someone who believed rules were beyond question. "Come in," he said, his tone heavy with formality. She stepped inside, clutching her books as though they could shield her. The office walls were lined with framed diplomas and motivational posters. "Excellence is a habit. Respect is earned." The words felt hollow here, stripped of meaning. The principal gestured for her to sit across from his desk. She obeyed quietly, her braids swaying as she lowered herself into the chair. He folded his hands, cleared his throat, and began with a rehearsed calmness. "We have certain standards here," he said, "standards designed to promote a professional, distraction-free environment for learning." Her eyes lifted to meet his. They were wide, confused, but steady. "But my hair isn't a distraction," she said softly. The corner of his mouth twitched, not in sympathy, but in irritation at being challenged. "This isn't about you personally," he replied. "It's about compliance with the rules. An unprofessional look is not appropriate for the learning environment." The word stung. Unprofessional look. She wanted to ask him, who decides what professional means? Why did her hair, her braids, the work of her mother's hands, suddenly count as unworthy of the classroom? But before she could form the questions, the office door opened again. Her parents entered. Her mother was the first through the door, her presence filling the room with quiet power. She was a woman who carried herself with grace, her posture straight, her eyes sharp. She wore a simple blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back in a bun that revealed her cheekbones. But her voice, when it came, trembled with controlled anger. "What is this about my daughter's hair?" she demanded, not bothering with pleasantries. Principal Harris leaned back slightly, adjusting his tie as if bracing himself. "Mrs. Johnson, thank you for coming. I understand this must seem upsetting, but we have clear guidelines here. Hairstyles must be professional, appropriate, and your daughter's choice, while expressive, is simply not in compliance." Her mother's hands tightened on the strap of her purse, her knuckles whitening, her voice lowered. But the tremor in it carried more fury than a shout ever could. "You're telling me that my child's hair, the hair God gave her, the hair I braided with my own hands last night, is not appropriate for learning? This isn't personal," the principal insisted, his words flat, his tone dismissive. "It's a matter of policy. If she refuses to adjust, we'll have to consider disciplinary measures." The girl's stomach clenched. Disciplinary measures. She had heard those words whispered in the hallways, usually about fights or truancy. Her chest tightened as another word slipped through the conversation like a blade. Suspension. Her father, quieter by nature, finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "Suspension for what?" "For braids, for beads, for being who she is." Principal Harris pressed his lips together as though the conversation was beneath him. For noncompliance, he answered, "We can't allow exceptions. If one student bends the rules, others will follow. Discipline must be consistent." Noncompliance. The word echoed in the girl's head. It sounded clinical, sterile, but what it meant was simple. If she refused to erase part of herself, they would erase her from the classroom. Her mother leaned forward, her eyes blazing now. "You call this consistency. I call it discrimination. You don't want her hair in your classroom because it doesn't fit your narrow idea of what's acceptable." The girl sat silently, her small hands tightening around the edge of her books. Fear knotted deep inside her, heavy and sharp, but alongside it burned something else, something hotter, defiance. She thought of the way her beads clicked like music when she walked. She thought of how her classmates had stared in confusion, not at her, but at the injustice of it all. She thought of her mother's hands weaving each braid with love, telling her, "Hold your head high, baby. Never hide who you are." She lifted her chin now, just slightly, though her voice stayed caught in her throat. She was afraid, terrified even of what suspension could mean. Missing classes, falling behind, being marked as trouble before she'd even had a chance to prove herself. But beneath the fear was the stubborn certainty that her hair was not wrong. Her hair was not a violation. Her hair was her. The conversation swirled on above her head, her mother's anger sharpened into precise words, her father's calm steadiness turning into steel, the principal's tone growing colder, more defensive. The words suspension, rules, noncompliance spun around her like storm winds, and in the middle of it, the girl sat, small and still, but with a fire beginning to grow in her chest, a fire that no handbook could put out. The day after the meeting, the school's decision lingered like a sour taste in the air. The girl returned home with her mother's protective arm around her shoulders. But even as the front door shut, behind them, the words unprofessional, noncompliance, suspension still clung to her skin like smoke. Her braids, once a source of lightness and pride, now felt heavier on her shoulders, as if every bead carried the weight of someone else's judgment. But the story did not stay locked in the office walls. It began in whispers, parents at pickup. Tom spoke in hushed tones near the curb. A father leaned against his car, shaking his head as he murmured to another parent, "They're punishing a little girl for her hair." The disbelief in his voice spread like ripples through water. Another mother, lips pressed tight, muttered, "If they can do this to her, who's next?" The whispers followed them home, settling into kitchens and living rooms. At dinner tables, conversations that should have been about homework and weekend plans turned instead to rules and fairness, to questions about identity and belonging. By Sunday, the whispers had reached the church. The congregation filled the small brick building, sunlight filtering through stained glass windows that splashed colors across the pews. The pastor, mid-sermon, paused when a woman raised her hand, her voice trembling with outrage as she spoke of the girl, of the school, of the words that tried to reduce her braids into something shameful. Murmurs rose from the crowd, voices overlapping outrage, disbelief, sorrow. A mother in the back wiped her eyes. An elder clutched his cane and said, "We've seen this before. Different times, different masks, but the same story." When the service ended, people gathered outside, the sunlight heavy on their shoulders, their words buzzing like bees. It was no longer just a school matter. It had become something larger, something deeper. Meanwhile, in a small barbershop down the street, a man stood with clippers in hand, shaking his head as the story reached his ears. The hum of the razor filled the room, but his mind was elsewhere. He glanced at the rows of young boys waiting for their haircuts, each with their own styles, fades, twists, curls. He thought of the girl, her braids so carefully done, and felt anger rise in his chest. Ridiculous, he muttered, snapping a photo of a handwritten sign and posting it online. They say our kids' hair is a violation. What they really mean is our kids are a violation. His post traveled faster than he expected. Within hours, dozens of comments appeared, then hundreds, each voice echoing the same outrage. People tagged their friends, shared the story, demanded to know why a child should suffer for something so deeply tied to who she was. At the market the next morning, an old grandmother paused by a stall selling fruit. Her eyes were sharp, her back slightly bent, her voice carrying the weight of years. She leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, though loudly enough for others to hear, "They want to punish a child for looking like her people." The word struck like a match in dry grass. Shoppers turned, listening, repeating, agreeing. "It's not right," one woman said, her basket half filled with oranges. "She should be celebrated, not shamed." The grandmother nodded, her chin firm. "We fought too hard for our children to walk proud, for them to try and bow their heads again." By afternoon, the story had reached the reporters. In a small newsroom, cluttered with stacks of papers and glowing computer screens, a young journalist read the post on her phone, frowning. It wasn't the first time she'd heard of schools clashing with students over hair, but something about this one felt different. The details, the beads, the threat of suspension. The mother's trembling voice lodged in her chest. She hesitated. Would it gain traction? Would anyone beyond this neighborhood care? But as she scrolled, she saw the shares piling up, the comments multiplying. People were already calling it what it was: discrimination. She opened a new document and began typing. The article went live before sundown. School threatens to suspend 13-year-old for braided hair. It was simple, almost understated. But the headline caught eyes, and soon the story spread beyond the city, beyond the state. The girl did not know all of this yet. She sat on her bed at home, homework spread in front of her, her beads clinking faintly as she bent her head. But she felt something shifting. The phone buzzed constantly with messages her mother read aloud. Friends, neighbors, strangers offering support. Her father's brows furrowed as he scrolled, his lips pressed tight in thought. The city was waking up. It started small, like a low hum in the background, but it grew each day. More people spoke, more people posted, more people demanded answers. By the end of the week, the whispers were no longer whispers. They were voices, loud, insistent, refusing to be ignored. Something was building, gathering force like a storm at sea, ready to crash against the quiet cruelty of a rule that had tried to make a child feel small. And the girl, sitting in her room with her beads resting against her shoulders, began to sense it too. She was not alone. The morning felt heavier than usual. The sky was washed in pale gray, as if the sun itself was reluctant to rise. The girl dressed in silence, slipping on her uniform with careful hands. Her braids brushed her shoulders as she bent to tie her shoes, the beads clicking faintly in the stillness of the house. She could hear her parents speaking softly in the kitchen, their voices hushed but urgent, carrying the weight of a storm that had been gathering for days. When her mother appeared at the doorway, her eyes softened but did not lose their fire. "We're walking you in today," she said firmly. The girl nodded, clutching her backpack straps. Her chest ached with uncertainty. She had heard the whispers at home, caught glimpses of the glowing screen as her father scrolled through article after article, watched her mother's phone buzz with calls from friends and neighbors. Still, in her heart, she imagined only a handful of supporters waiting, a few parents, perhaps, maybe a familiar face from church, enough to stand with her, but small enough to be overlooked. The walk to school was quiet, save for the steady rhythm of footsteps on the pavement. She walked between her parents, her braids swaying against her shoulders, each bead chiming softly as if reminding her to stay brave. She braced herself for another long day, for another confrontation, for another round of being told her very presence was a problem. But as they turned the corner and the school gates came into view, a sound reached her ears. At first, it was a murmur, low, indistinct, like the distant hum of a crowd at a fair. But with each step, it grew louder, voices, many voices, layered together. She slowed, her heartbeat quickening, her palms growing damp. Then she saw them. The entire block was filled. Hundreds of people lined the street, their bodies forming a river of resistance that stretched from the school's iron gates to the far end of the block. Parents, students, pastors in long robes, shop owners still wearing their aprons, young men and women with fists raised high, strangers who had never spoken her name but had come anyway, pulled by something greater than themselves. And everywhere she looked, she saw hair, crowns of natural beauty in every form, afros blooming like halos, locks cascading down backs, braids woven with beads that clinked in the morning air, twists tied neatly in scarves. Even the allies who did not share her heritage had come, adorned white women in head wraps, white men wearing wigs of curls or beads, standing shoulder to shoulder in solidarity. The girl stopped in her tracks, her breath caught in her throat. She had expected whispers, maybe quiet support. Instead, she found herself staring at a sea of people, their presence roaring louder than any chant. Her mother squeezed her shoulder, her father's hand resting firm against her back. "This is for you," her mother whispered, her voice trembling not with anger this time, but with awe. The crowd began to clap as she approached. The sound swelled, filling the air with thunder. Some held signs painted hastily on cardboard. "Our hair, our pride, let her learn. Black is beautiful." Others raised their voices in chants that shook the morning stillness. "Let her learn. Let her learn." The girl's chest tightened, tears pressing at the corners of her eyes. She had never seen so many people gathered for her hair, for her right to simply exist as herself. On the steps of the school stood Principal Harris. His face, usually set in that rigid mask of authority, was pale now. His hands clutched the railing as he stared out at the crowd, his mouth opening and closing without words. He had thought this was a small matter of policy, a rule, a detail to be enforced and then forgotten. But here, before him, was proof of what he had underestimated. This was not about beads, not about braids. This was about dignity. This was about decades of silence, discrimination, years of children being told they were too much, too loud, too visible. It was about generations forced to shrink themselves to fit someone else's idea of what was proper. And now, on this gray morning, the silence had been broken. The girl's legs trembled as she walked past the crowd, but her chin was lifted. Her braids swung proudly, each bead shimmering like a note of defiance. She saw the cameras flashing, reporters scribbling in notepads, microphones raised to catch every word. She heard the chants, the clapping, the laughter of children holding their own braids high in the air as symbols of victory. She realized then, this was bigger than her. Her presence had become a spark, but the fire belonged to everyone. When she stepped through the school gates, the sound of the crowd followed her. It wrapped around her shoulders like armor, louder than the buzzing lights, louder than the principal's silence. For the first time in days, she did not feel small, she felt unbreakable. And as she glanced once over her shoulder, meeting the eyes of hundreds who stood with her, she understood a truth that would never leave her. They could try to shame her, but they could never make her invisible. The protest outside the school had been impossible to ignore. By midday, news crews crowded the sidewalks, their cameras perched on tripods, lenses capturing every angle of the restless crowd. The chants echoed through the neighborhood, spilling beyond the schoolyard, carrying through open car windows, drifting into nearby shops. By evening, the school board had no choice but to act. Inside the district building, an emergency meeting was called. The board members filed into the room with tight jaws and tense shoulders, their polished shoes squeaking against the floor. They faced rows of angry parents, students holding handmade signs, and reporters ready to document every word. The fluorescent lights glared down on the long oak table where decisions had always been made quietly, away from public eyes. But this time, there was no silence to protect them. The girl sat with her parents near the front row. Her braids rested neatly against her shoulders, beads clicking softly whenever she shifted in her chair. Her mother's hand was firm around hers, her father's presence steady on her other side. They were her anchor in this storm, but she could feel the eyes of the crowd behind her, hundreds of them burning with solidarity. The superintendent cleared his throat, his voice strained as he began. "We are here tonight to address concerns regarding the enforcement of our school dress code." A murmur ran through the crowd, sharp and impatient. The words sounded rehearsed, evasive. Cameras zoomed closer. Reporters scribbled furiously. Principal Harris, seated stiffly at one end of the table, shifted uncomfortably. He had not expected this. He had imagined the matter would be handled with a signature, a quiet meeting, a suspension that would fade into paperwork. Instead, he now faced an audience that refused to let this story vanish. Parent after parent rose to speak. "This is not about professionalism," one father declared, his voice trembling with anger. "This is about discrimination, plain and simple." A teacher stepped forward, her voice breaking as she said, "I've taught for 20 years. Never have I seen a hairstyle distract a child from learning, but I've seen injustice do it every time." The crowd clapped, their voices swelling, demanding answers. Finally, the girl's mother stood. Her words cut through the noise, trembling but powerful. "You wanted to tell my daughter that her hair makes her unfit to learn, but look around. Look at this city standing with her. Her braids are not the problem, your rules are." The room shook with applause, cameras flashed. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Hours dragged on, the air thick with tension. But the longer the crowd pressed, the clearer it became. There was no defending the rule. Not with the world watching. Not with children in the audience holding up their braids and locks as living proof of resilience. At last, near midnight, the decision came. The superintendent leaned forward, his voice tight, deliberate, effective immediately. The ban on hairstyles such as braids, locks, and beads is revoked. The words cracked open the silence. Gasps filled the room, followed by cheers so loud the walls seemed to tremble. Reporters rushed to capture the moment, microphones shoved forward, cameras flashing like starlight. Parents hugged their children. Strangers embraced one another. A chant rose, strong and unstoppable. Our hair, our pride, our hair, our pride. The girl sat frozen for a moment, her heart hammering. Then her mother pulled her close, tears glistening in her eyes. They tried to take your light, baby, she whispered, her voice breaking. But look at you lit up the whole city instead. The next morning dawned bright, as if the world itself had shifted overnight. The girl dressed slowly, deliberately. She wore her uniform the same as always, but today her braids seemed to shine with a new brilliance. Her mother had retied the beads, each one polished, each one catching the morning sun like tiny gems. She studied herself in the mirror, shoulders back, chin high. For the first time since the ordeal began, she did not feel like she was bracing for a fight. She felt victorious. Walking into the school, the air felt different. It was alive, charged with change. Students clustered by the doors, some whispering, some smiling openly as she passed. A few wore braids or twists themselves, heads lifted higher than usual, as though her battle had somehow given them permission to breathe freer. The hallway was no longer filled with wary silence. Instead, a ripple of applause broke out as she entered. Clap, clap, clap. It began softly, then grew louder, until the sound echoed through the corridors. Her classmates, the same ones who had once exchanged puzzled, silent glances, now clapped openly, their faces bright with admiration. Some stood, raising their hands high, others simply nodded, their eyes shining with respect. The girl walked slowly through it all, her beads chiming with every step clear. Proud notes of triumph, tick, 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 like bells ringing at the end of a long, hard battle. When she slid into her seat, the applause still swelled around her. She looked up at the chalkboard, the familiar words scrawled in white dust, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for the first time in days. The classroom felt like a place she belonged, and as she opened her notebook, her heart still racing, she realized something profound. They hadn't just revoked a ban. They had given her and every child who looked like her permission to exist, as they were always meant to. Her hair was no longer a violation. Her hair was a victory. When the noise of applause finally faded and the school day returned to its ordinary rhythm, something inside the young girl remained changed forever. She sat at her desk with her notebook open, pencil in hand, but the world felt heavier, fuller, more alive. The classroom walls no longer pressed in on her like they had yesterday. They seemed wider now, as if the entire building had been stretched open by the voices of hundreds who had gathered. Outside its gates, her braids swayed gently as she leaned over her paper, the beads clicking like a rhythm only she could hear. They were not just accessories anymore. They were echoes of a battle, reminders of resilience, symbols of a truth too powerful to be erased. It wasn't just about hair. It had never been just about hair. The struggle was about dignity, the basic, unshakable dignity of being human. The right to walk into a room and know you belong there, without apology, without explanation. The right to sit in a classroom and not feel that your very existence is being questioned. For years, society had found ways to disguise prejudice in polite words, professional, appropriate, distracting. But those words had been weapons, sharper than they seemed, aimed at children who only wanted to be themselves. And here, in the bright corridors of an ordinary suburban school, a line had been drawn at last. The city had learned something too. A week ago, neighbors nodded politely but kept to themselves. Parents hurried through errands, their lives parallel but separate. But once the story spread once, whispers became posts, and posts became protests. They discovered something profound. Their voices were stronger together. The barber who first shook his head and typed out a message online, the grandmother at the market who muttered her disapproval, the teachers who finally spoke out, all of them had become threads in the same fabric. And that fabric had wrapped itself around a 13-year-old girl, shielding her, lifting her, declaring to the world, she will not stand alone. The principal's silence in the face of the protest was telling, almost cinematic. He had underestimated the fire he had lit with a single careless decision. He thought it was about rules, about order, but the crowd proved it was about justice, and when justice knocks, it does not knock softly, it thunders. The girl herself carried something away from this ordeal that no textbook could have taught her. She learned that fear and courage often sit side by side in the same chest, that even when her heart felt like it was collapsing under the weight of shame and confusion, there could still be a spark of defiance waiting to catch fire. She had overheard words like suspension and noncompliance, words meant to bend her into silence. Instead, they had ignited something greater. And now she knew what they tried to shame her for: her hair, her culture, her identity could become the very symbol that united a movement. The story spread beyond the school, beyond the city. Local papers ran headlines. National outlets picked it up. Images of the protest, of children and parents standing side by side with their hair free and proud, traveled farther than the administrators ever imagined. Strangers in other towns wrote letters of support. Activists spoke her name at rallies, using her story as proof of why laws needed to change. But beneath all the headlines and interviews, the most important transformation was quieter, almost invisible. It was in the way her classmates looked at her differently now, not with pity, not with confusion, but with respect. It was in the way some of them wore their own hair proudly the next day. Inspired by her defiance, it was in the way teachers hesitated before enforcing rules, questioning whether policy was truly fair or simply habit. A city that once looked away had learned to stand together, and in the heart of it all stood a girl with braids and beads, her eyes brighter, her steps firmer, her sense of self unshakable. Years from now, when she looked back on this chapter of her life, she would not remember only the sting of injustice or the knot of fear in her chest. She would remember the sight of an entire block filled with people who came for her. She would remember the sound of voices chanting in unison, refusing to let her be erased. She would remember walking into her classroom the next morning, her beads chiming like tiny bells of victory, greeted not by silence but by applause, and she would know, deep in her bones, that she had not just won back her right to wear her hair, she had helped awaken a city. She had reminded them all that dignity is not something given by an institution. It is something carried fiercely and unapologetically within each person, and she had shown them that sometimes a child's courage can do what decades of silence cannot: break chains. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Never let them convince you that being yourself is a violation. Never shrink to fit someone else's idea of who you should be, because the very thing they try to shame you for may one day become the banner under which countless others will rise. The young girl had come to school with braids. She left with something far greater, the knowledge that her identity was not just her own to carry, but a gift, a symbol, a spark, and once lit, a spark can set the world alight.